Tonight, the Strait of Hormuz has recorded an event whose strategic consequences will reorganize the global maritime order in ways that the architects of American naval supremacy spent 80 years insisting could never occur. What unfolded in the narrow waters between the Iranian coastline and the Omani shore in the hours before dawn was not a naval battle in any sense that American operational doctrine has defined that term across 8 decades of carrier-centered maritime strategy. It was the systematic destruction of 10 American destroyers, the vessels that form the defensive backbone of every carrier strike group and every major American naval formation, sunk in sequence by a ballistic missile barrage whose targeting precision and operational sequencing reflected years of Iranian analytical investment in the specific problem of killing American surface combatants inside the world's most strategically consequential waterway. 1,000 Fateh 313 missiles, not a quantity chosen for its symbolic weight, but the volume that Iranian strike planners had calculated across years of analysis of American destroyer defensive capacity, engagement rates, and magazine depth, would produce the comprehensive destruction the engagement achieved. The Fateh 313 is not the largest or the longest-range platform in the Iranian ballistic missile inventory. It is the most precise. A short-range ballistic missile whose guidance refinement over multiple development generations has produced a circular error probable measured in meters against moving naval targets, combined with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle whose terminal phase behavior was specifically engineered to defeat the intercept solutions that the standard missile systems aboard American destroyers compute and commit to in the seconds before warhead arrival. 10 destroyers. The entirety of the American destroyer presence concentrated in the Hormuz operational zone. Vessels whose combined Aegis defensive capacity had been assessed by American planning as sufficient to defeat any ballistic missile threat a regional adversary could realistically generate. That assessment rested on a threat model whose parameters Iranian operational planners had studied with the explicit intention of exceeding them. The assessment was exceeded. The destroyers are on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz, and the question of what the American naval presence in the Persian Gulf theater looks like without the destroyer force that gave it its defensive coherence is now the operational reality that CENTCOM is attempting to manage. The Arleigh Burke class destroyer is the most capable surface combatant in the American fleet by any conventional measurement. The Aegis combat system it carries integrates radar, fire control, and weapons employment into a unified architecture whose engagement capacity has been the foundation of American naval air defense planning for 3 decades. The Spy-1 radar provides the long-range detection coverage, whose data feeds the engagement calculations that allow the standard missile to be fired against incoming ballistic threats at ranges sufficient to intercept them well outside the defended ship's immediate envelope. Under the threat conditions American planning had modeled, this architecture represented a genuine and formidable defensive capability. The Fateh 313's maneuvering re-entry vehicle does not engage this architecture at the detection layer or the fire control layer. It engages it at the intercept solution layer, the specific computational moment when the standard missile has been launched on a calculated trajectory and the incoming warhead executes the aerodynamic course correction that renders the computed trajectory invalid. The standard missile, already committed to its intercept course, cannot recompute and adjust within the time the terminal closing geometry allows. At individual engagement scale, this challenge is manageable through the employment of multiple interceptors against each incoming threat. At the scale of 1,000 missiles arriving against 10 destroyers simultaneously, the magazine arithmetic becomes the dominant operational variable, and the magazine arithmetic last night produced the result the Persian Gulf is now recording. Iranian naval strike planners had reconstructed the specific defensive capacity of the American destroyer formation operating in the Hormuz zone through years of observation, signals intelligence collection, and the analytical study of every publicly available data point on Aegis system performance against ballistic missile threats. The engagement architecture they designed around that reconstructed capacity was built on 3 operational principles. First, the incoming volume had to exceed the combined magazine capacity of the formation before the last missiles of the salvo arrived in the terminal phase. Second, the approach vector distribution had to force simultaneous defensive engagement across every vessel in the formation, preventing any destroyer from concentrating its defensive output against a subset of the incoming threats. Third, the sequencing had to target the most capable air defense vessels earliest, degrading the formation's collective defensive architecture before the waves directed at the remaining vessels arrived. The first wave, 250 missiles, was concentrated against the two destroyers whose Aegis configurations carried the most capable ballistic missile defense variants, the vessels whose standard missile SM-3 inventories represented the formation's primary capacity for high-altitude intercept of the incoming ballistic threats. By directing the opening wave against these specific platforms at a volume calculated to exhaust their SM-3 inventories within the first minutes of the engagement, the Iranian operation immediately removed the defensive layer most capable of defeating the subsequent waves before they reached their terminal phases. The first wave did not need to sink the targeted destroyers, though two of them were struck and one was sunk before the wave had fully resolved. It needed to consume the interceptor inventories of the formation's most capable defensive assets, and that objective was achieved within 8 minutes of the first missile crossing Iranian coastal airspace. The second wave, 350 missiles, arrived against the remaining 8 destroyers in a multi-axis approach geometry, whose bearing distribution forced each vessel to simultaneously engage threats arriving from directions that its radar coverage and its weapons employment geometry had not been configured to address together. A destroyer whose Aegis system is simultaneously managing threat tracks arriving from the northwest, the north, and the northeast is not operating within the engagement parameters its doctrine was optimized around. It is managing a sensor fusion and fire control problem whose computational demands were not the design baseline for the system it is operating. The engagement rates the surviving destroyers achieved in the second wave were below the theoretical maximum the Aegis system can sustain under the conditions it was designed for, because the conditions of the second wave were not the conditions Aegis was designed for. 3 more destroyers were sunk in the second wave. 4 more sustained damage sufficient to remove them from effective defensive operation for the duration of the engagement. The third wave, 400 missiles, arrived against a formation whose defensive coherence had been comprehensively destroyed by the first 2 waves. 3 destroyers remained capable of any meaningful defensive response, each operating on depleted interceptor inventories, each managing damage from previous wave impacts, each attempting to maintain defensive operation under conditions their crews had not trained for, because the planning framework that governed training had not anticipated a threat of this character. Against 400 incoming Fateh 313 warheads, whose terminal maneuver behavior was producing the intercept failures that the first 2 waves had already demonstrated, the residual defensive output of 3 damaged destroyers with depleted magazines produced the outcome the engagement's conclusion makes undeniable. The remaining 7 destroyers were struck in the third wave. By the time the last Fateh 313 warhead had completed its terminal descent, 10 American destroyers had been sunk or rendered permanently combat ineffective in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. The Fateh 313's development trajectory reflects the Iranian engineering philosophy that has produced every operationally significant capability in its arsenal, not the pursuit of maximum performance across every parameter simultaneously, but the focused refinement of the specific characteristics that matter most against the specific defensive architecture the weapon is intended to defeat. The guidance precision that produces meter-level accuracy against moving naval targets. The maneuvering re-entry vehicle that defeats computed intercept solutions. The solid fuel propulsion that compresses launch preparation time into the window that allows tactical surprise. The production volume that makes the 1,000-missile salvo an operational reality rather than a theoretical planning scenario. Every development decision in the Fateh 313 program points toward the same operational problem, and last night that problem was the American destroyer formation in the Strait of Hormuz. The production infrastructure underlying the availability of 1,000 Fateh 313 missiles for a single engagement has been built across years of Iranian industrial investment, whose scale Western assessments consistently decline to credit at its actual magnitude. The solid fuel manufacturing facilities, the guidance component production lines, the final assembly and quality assurance infrastructure, all of this exists at a production rate that accumulates the operational inventory, the engagement expended over a timeline measured in months rather than years. Every sanction that targeted the industrial inputs this manufacturing base required, instead generated the indigenous sourcing capability that removed the dependency the sanctions were designed to exploit. The pressure designed to keep the Fateh 313 inventory below operationally significant levels instead produced the inventory that last night consumed 10 American destroyers. In the hours following the confirmation of 10 destroyers sunk, the American national security establishment entered the specific institutional crisis that the loss of major naval assets in a contested theater produces, multiplied by the strategic context of the Hormuz location and the energy market consequences that the waterway's operational status now carries. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of globally traded petroleum transits on any given day, is now an active battlefield whose surface is covered with the wreckage of the American naval formation that was positioned to guarantee its navigational freedom. The insurance markets for tanker transits have suspended coverage. The energy companies operating in the Gulf have begun the contingency procedures that their risk management frameworks specify for exactly this scenario. The price consequences are transmitting across every market whose cost structure incorporates energy price assumptions. The military options available to the administration in those hours were each constrained by the operational reality the engagement had produced. Retaliation against Iranian coastal strike infrastructure, at the scale the loss of 10 destroyers would conventionally demand, required naval fire support assets whose availability in the theater had just been comprehensively reduced. Airstrikes from land-based assets were a genuine option, but executing them against a coastal defense infrastructure that had just demonstrated its capacity to defeat American surface combatants at scale, while simultaneously managing the Hormuz closure and its global economic consequences, produced a decision geometry in which every available path led through additional costs the political system was not positioned to absorb. The global response to the Hormuz engagement is not bounded by the immediate military balance. In Beijing, in Moscow, in every capital whose strategic interests are served by a recalibration of American naval reach in the Gulf theater, the engagement is being processed as operational confirmation of analytical conclusions that had previously rested on theoretical foundations. The American destroyer is the universal instrument of American naval presence. It is the vessel that shows up in every theater, every coalition, every forward deployment. 10 of them on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz is not a regional military event. It is a global strategic signal whose reception in every capital where American naval presence has functioned as a deterrent argument will reshape the calculations those capitals make about what American guarantees are actually worth. The Strait of Hormuz is quieter now than it was when the missiles were arriving. The wreckage of 10 American destroyers is settling into the shallow waters of the world's most important energy corridor. The navigational channel, whose freedom of passage has been guaranteed by American naval presence since the tanker wars of the 1980s, is now a question mark whose answer Iran controls. In a maritime theater where 1,000 Fateh 313 missiles can sink 10 American destroyers in a single coordinated engagement, what does freedom of navigation actually require? And who possesses the capacity to provide it? Iran has provided its answer in the hours before dawn. The global order that has organized itself around a different answer is still formulating its response, and the time available for that formulation is being measured against consequences that are already arriving.